As we use this season to dive into American cuisine, we continue by reviewing the culinary and scholarly work behind author Jessica B. Harris and Stephen Satterfield's High on the Hog, presented by Netflix, posing questions of how this information will change the way we appreciate the origins of American cuisine. Returning guests Kevin, Vince, and myself will tap into questions around the physical, cultural, and historical contributions of African Americans to what is currently known as American cuisine by way of this docuseries. The conversation will be had over a seafood gumbo, with seafood provided by Sacramento's own Sunh Seafood.
And we're rolling. Good to go.
All right. Well, welcome back, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
This is a fun one. The docuseries High on the Hog. It's getting a lot of buzz, and I think it was personally just an amazing series. Answered a lot of questions. Really went and kind of gave us a new idea of what we thought the history of American cuisine was, though getting into the origin and such. So today, in being inspired by the series, I made gumbo, which Vince, this is the first time you've ever had it.
It was amazing. I loved it. And I would say...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that having the privilege of watching him make it was... it's amazing. The whole process seems so simple. And I think the ingredients were all very crucial, obviously. But when you have it all laid out, you're seeing it all, and then you're getting it all put in the pot, it just seems so very easy. Like, why don't more people make it?
It's deceptively simple.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I want to kind of point across is that, gumbo is one of the things that, since once again, my family's heritage is from Louisiana, it's one of those ways in which you basically cut your teeth, culinarily speaking, within households. And the thing about it is that gumbo, at least my own analyses of it, is so much more of a philosophy rather than a recipe. It's almost as a theory. So it's like the way that Bryan makes it, and Bryan is an incredibly talented yet incredibly humble chef. The way that he has outlined how he has made it is very, very different than how I would make it. And neither one is better nor worse, right? But just the tried and true idea of putting together a gumbo. Like I said, it's a very humble set of ingredients, but just it's an absolute symphony on the palate when it all comes together.
It really is. And the thing I was explaining to you as I was making it is timing, and like how each ingredient comes in at a certain point, and it changes the whole dynamic of what you're actually going to taste at the end. And one of the things that was really unique about this one that I just decided I was going to play with is kind of bringing in a little bit of an Asian flip to it.
Okay.
By making the
Asian flair.
leek and shrimp dashi.
Right.
And using that as my shrimp stock. It kept shaking his head like I can't believe
it came through.
Is what I'm saying inside of my head, and I just articulate out of my mouth.
It's hard to describe.
Yeah.
You know what you ain't, Bryan Hankins? You know what you ain't? You haven't got to cut that out.
Right.
So kids.
Right.
I can't say exactly what I think that you ain't, but exactly you know what you ain't, Bryan Hankins.
You know, Bryan. You know.
Well,
by the way, for those that are outsiders looking in and hearing into this conversation, that is probably the highest compliment that Bryan and I pay to each other when we make something incredibly delicious.
Basically.
You know what you ain't,
Yeah. And it's interesting that another reason why I did that is because there's a huge Vietnamese population in Louisiana, period.
Yes,
and it's been there forever. So it's kind of touching back on that first conversation that we had and saying like, there's places where you can start adding new cultures and ingredients and things and still hold on to exactly what it is. It's authenticity in every way. So it was really fun just kind of experimenting with that and seeing what would happen. And apparently it worked. So
as somebody who just saw the pictures of it and living vicariously through both of you, I really hate watching my food with another man, but I'm very happy it's in both of your palate and stomachs right now.
I will say having the privilege to have a friend who is a chef, but also, humble enough to make his skill set, open and available to you. I think that's like, an amazing thing. I'll say, I will thank you for that.
Because all kinds of compliments today. Hold on.
No, but it's real because you've introduced me to a lot of different types of foods, and not only at restaurants. It's the stuff that you made at your house. So.
And
I love it.
Kevin, you cooked today as well, right?
I did. So what I made was in far pale comparison to any gumbos that were made, but I took the ethos of High on the Hog and actually put together a dish called Limpin' Susan. So what Limpin' Susan is historically has always been rice and okra, which is a distant cousin to Hoppin' John. So Hoppin' John is rice and usually some sort of bean, black-eyed pea, red island, sea peas, for instance. But it's those sort of basic items that are incredibly humble in nature, but they are elevated to another degree. And for me, okra was so incredibly important, just in terms of, when you take a look at, the work that, Jessica B. Harris is doing, you saw okra, specifically in the first episode, as really being one of those things that is inextricably African. So I wanted to draw upon, I think, that inspiration with, my meal today. So I made Limpin' Susan, which is, like I said, okra and rice, very simple on the surface, but I also used Carolina Gold rice. From Anson Mills, which was featured in the second episode of today. So once again, trying to tie in just the entire sort of narrative of the piece. I finished it with a little smoked chicken stock, which I made in-house from actually smoking the chicken bones, and then finished that on just to kind of create, just a almost gravy. So what I did is, after roasting, or at least, just sauteing the okra, getting a little bit of color on it, simply adding the stock, and through the natural slime or mucilage of the okra, that actually created almost a gravy, so to speak, when you just simply sort of agitate it. All right. And then I finished it with this sweet and hot seafood spice that has a lot of there's jalapeno powder in it. There's also a decent amount of celery seed in it as well, to just add just another element of flavor, and then finish it up with a little bit of thyme just on top. So,
dang.
And pale in comparison.
Man.
Yeah. Okay.
Just the description alone is like.
Well, okay.
I want to know what it tastes like now.
Shoot, I want to know what this gumbo with dashi tastes like. How about that?
Yeah.
How
and
about
I think
that?
and that's a great segue, kind of going into the first episode. And I was laughing with Vince about the whole point of okra and gumbo having two meanings, and in French, that you're basically asking for okra, and the soup or the dish is okra based.
Right.
And it, go ahead.
And one of the things that was really interesting about that is something that I wanted to kind of comment on today. Hopefully I'm not stepping on your toes when I make this next statement. But what's fascinating, Bryan, is that you made that connection. I believe in French, it's also okra, which also means gumbo, if I understand your logic.
Right.
Okay. Now, historically, there's this larger idea of lineage that traces Africans in the diaspora back to the continent, irrespective of where you're at as part of the transatlantic slave trade. So case in point, there's this man named Melville J. Herskovits who wrote this book all about what are known as Africanisms. And if anybody is ever listening to this and needs to cite this for a paper, all right, if you need to cite this, it's also found in the very first chapter of Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower. If you need a secondary source to this, it's also found in chapter 19 of John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. One of the things that Melville J. Herskovits is noting from a linguistic standpoint is a lot of patterns that find itself from the home continent of Africa and move on over into the New World. Okay, so one of those items is gumbo, in terms of actually the soup, but it's most importantly okra is the title, yet the term that we associate with gumbo is going to be okra. And so how there's this really sort of lineage in terms of how the African continent really begins to spread itself in more ways than one on multiple continents as well, too. And so just absolutely fascinating in terms of there's this idea that Africans were brought to any individual continent void of any background culture. They were just simply on the recipient ends of taking orders. Pick this up, move this, do this, that, and the third. And they're always oftentimes we're painted as being very much empty vessels. Herskovitz takes a lot of that out of the conversation by saying this is still something that is so incredibly us. But I think it's really interesting and fascinating that one of the terms that he brings up is actually the interchangeability between the term okra, the vegetable, with the dish gumbo.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, it takes us through a lot of what I think was discussed in, well, some of these episodes, especially the first one.
Right. I mean, in the first episode, obviously they went through okra being a staple, and it was funny. One of my favorite parts, we'll get to the yams and the sweet potatoes in a minute, because that's going to be a long discussion, because everyone's still arguing.
That's part of my notes too.
We're all going to talk about that. But I love the part where they go back to the hot sauce. She's like, you ain't at the right place if you don't have hot sauce on the table, right? Like if you don't have that small bottle, but it's a familiar flavor. It's something that is still present. It's something we always have been, always added to things. So I love that element.
As do a lot of other cultures too. I mean, hot sauce or peppers, chilies. I mean, they grow in abundance in a lot of different countries, and so you notice that in Indian food, a lot of spices. So chili, big deal there. Latin American cuisine too, I think.
And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, Vince, because I'm just going based on what I know. When we talk about spice, we're just talking about how or spicy elements, right? So with Latin cuisine, it comes more from chilies.
Right, yeah.
When you're talking Indian or Middle Eastern, it's going to come more from like, not powder, but spices in general, right? It's the combination of spices where they get the heat from, like cayenne and all of that stuff. It's a completely different type of,
I guess maybe
chili.
You think of like ground heat, ground up
like
heat,
ground spices,
adding ground spices as opposed to adding whole peppers or whole chilies to a dish.
Exactly.
Which I think in Latin American cuisine, you probably get a lot more whole peppers or dried chilies, just marinating in there.
Gotcha. And I feel like the African cuisine, it's more around and mind you, I'm still learning more about the cuisine itself. It's around fermentation. And that's kind of where the spice, that's what's bringing out the heat in it. So just a fun little part of the interchangeability of hot sauce.
Yeah.
And I think just you're right about that in terms of the presence of it, in terms of how it made Satterfield. For those that haven't watched the show too. So I think one thing that I kind of want to do is kind of, maybe if it's okay, kind of lay a little bit of groundwork in terms of what the show is for people that maybe have never seen it. Really the term high on the hog, or at least the title of the show is number one, and is an idiom that is really being utilized in a lot of African-American culture, in terms of it harkens back to a time in which when those that were enslaved were given the opportunity to have something that went beyond just the trash of what other people were talking about. So in a certain sense of relative to sort of decadence or luxury, in terms of eating high on the hog. And one sort of physical manner of being able to eat well off of a different component of the animal, because as many of us know, those enslaved Africans were given just the trash parts of any animal, the offal, OFFAL, and had to use that in conjunction with just what was available to you in order to provide basic sort of nourishment and sustenance. And so therefore you have this beautiful cuisine that we commonly know as soul food, which is really a wonderful and beautiful conglomerate of cooking techniques, as well as limited ingredients here in the States to create something that is so incredibly unique and special to what's found here, derivative of those of African descent here on the American continent. Now, taking that term, Jessica B. Harris, wonderful, brilliant cultural anthropologist, has written a text on this, which really served as the backdrop in which she really kind of starts off the very first leg of the journey. Yet Stephen Satterfield, an absolutely brilliant young man who's classically trained as a chef, went to culinary school, also is a sommelier as well, is the host who is the constant sort of cadence throughout the entire course of the 4-part episode and series. And so within the very first episode really takes a look at the African continent before the European penetration of what we know now as chattel slavery, as well as before the transatlantic slave trade really starts to kind of come about. And one of the things that I found incredibly fascinating about the 4-part series is the overall narratology of it in terms of the story arc of
Absolutely.
it.
Right.
Because one of the things that he does, he and Jessica B. Harris too, do, which is a very, very fine job, is showing what Africa was like before European penetration. And so we're able to see this before anybody else in terms of showing the rich history, the culture of what's going on in Benin, in West Africa, that I think for many people might be a very illuminating sort of conversation in terms of I had never ever seen or even thought of, sadly, the kind of Africa this precise, this advanced, this organized. I think a lot of times, sadly, within our society, Africa has always been pitched as the dark continent, backwards, for lack of a better term, savage.
Right.
And that's been something that's been part of, I think, a lot of people's conversations and a lot of people's narratives. Now, there are hundreds of years of deliberate labor that's very much coaxed in racism in terms of being able to sort of perpetuate that narrative. But what we have here within this very first episode really dispels a lot of that moving forward. So I just want to use that just kind of hopefully as a background and maybe kind of pivot to future conversations where we're going to go this evening. For those that maybe have not had a chance to see the episodes yet.
Right. That first episode was beautiful because, again, they were going into the ingredients. And now we'll bring up the conversation of the yams and sweet potatoes. Okay, I had never seen a yam, apparently.
A real yam.
When I saw that, I was like, oh, that's a real yam. Like, it's completely different than what I expected. Like, it's just interesting. I'm just like, it was weird. Like, it was just weird for me, like, because I had such a different idea of what a yam, like, or what I grew up with. And I knew the difference between sweet potatoes and yams. That wasn't a problem. But it was also, this was like the actual, like, from Africa yam. Like, and it was huge.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, I think she called it, it looks like elephant's foot, right?
Yeah.
It's a 4-toed elephant's foot. And it's exactly, if you haven't seen the show, it looks exactly like that. I mean, it's...
Yeah. And
bizarre almost.
Yeah. It is startling, I think, for somebody that has never seen it before. I have seen it in various instances, but just to kind of be reminded of it is something that is incredibly different from what we here in the continental US associate with the concept of yams. And Bryan, I'm so glad you brought this up. This is one of the things that I really had wanted to talk about this evening is the differences between sweet potatoes and yams. Very, very, very big difference between the two. So, one of the things that I had wanted to kind of write about. So a little bit of my background is that I have my master's degree in English, primarily in 20th century literature. And one of the things that I was really fascinated with is there's this book by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man. One of the greatest books, I think, written in the 20th century. Absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that happens to the unnamed protagonist, who is certainly of African descent, is he migrates from the south and moves on over to the north, really part of that great migration, which so many Africans, part of the diaspora here in the US really took place, in the early 19-teens. Right, with the hopes of African Americans receiving basically the Bill of Rights, the hopes of getting a better tomorrow, and how North has always been our beacon of progress. If we can just simply get to the North, we would ultimately get to where we were always supposed to go. Right, going back to the emancipation, or just running away from slavery, getting to the North. Okay, so anyway, the narrator comes to the street vendor, basically a early prototypical food truck. And there's a man that's selling yams. In his mind, he's selling yams. Okay. And so he constantly calls out to the people on the street, I'm selling yams, Carolina yams, sweet as all, get that in the third. Okay. However, one thing that I know is that he's consuming the sweet potato. It's based on our own rich cultural history kind of behind that. So there's a very big slippage between the yam and the sweet potato, which for me mirrored the namelessness of the protagonist in the text in terms of there's no real place for him to actually find his name. And there is this always sort of constant sort of struggle that he has to kind of be able to find and be able to sort of assert himself. All right. Now, one of the things that we often talk about on holidays, specifically in the African American community, is one of those most coveted sides is going to be, as you know, Bryan, candied what?
Yams.
Now, it's the title with which we call them, but as we very well know, those are sweet potatoes. Now, most likely they're red garnet or Beauregard types of sweet potatoes, just to get into a little more specificity of the actual type, but they're the furthest thing from an actual yam. Right. But there's a certain way in which, the yams from the continent of Africa, huge in scale. Vince, you're exactly right. As Dr. Harris had commented on, very much reminiscent of an elephant's foot. But also, if you look historically in African cultures, on the West Coast and Nigeria in particular too, yams and your access to yams was also a form of currency. So you were able to demonstrate your wealth based on how many yams that you had. If anybody on the call has ever read Things Fall Apart by Chinwe Achebe, he talks a lot about that in the text as well. But once again, they're simply white. And so it's one of those things, perhaps it's an Africanism, maybe, in terms of how we're able to kind of translate this idea from the West Coast, moving on over here into the United States, in terms of how do we find something that is so meaningful to us pre-Europe? How do we kind of replicate that here within?
It's very interesting because I think, on the episode, when they were walking through the market, she was saying that yams are going to be the most abundant thing that you see in the market. It was like the most commonly sold thing there, which in my mind, thinking about what you're saying with, flexing how much yams you got, it seems like whoever corners the market on the yams over there probably would be the person that everybody's going to go to for, everything else maybe. I don't know. But I did like the interplay between him and her when they were, she was sort of like riffing off of that idea, when you're having Thanksgiving dinner, you're not having candied, yams. And then he picked up on it and he was just immediately like, candied sweet potato, and it was, it was just very interesting to see that a lot of people probably know these differences, but maybe like through no fault of their own, they just have not been able to acknowledge them, or maybe, I don't know, people don't care to acknowledge them.
Right. And I want to take this moment to kind of, that's what I'm about to say, it will kind of help bring it into why this is so important. Satterfield said, they get to come home with me and I get to bring them home. And that was the way he could explain being back in Africa. When it comes to cuisine, when we're talking about how we go to places to eat and everything, it's a very similar idea. And how many times have we seen people fail at expressing these cuisines, and why? Like, why is it so hard for people to actually say, okay, I'm going to bring as much of its authenticity here as possible?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think failing expressing cuisine. How often do we see this fail? Yeah, I have to think about that
one. So Kevin and I, we went to shout out to Kyle Connaughton, Single Thread, and one of the most amazing dinners, dinners.
We have another conversation just solely on how amazing
exactly
that meal is, and just let him know how much we appreciate he and his entire team, just the craftsmanship of that meal, start to finish. I don't have enough hours. You don't have enough battery.
No,
To
no,
contain
Definitely
how
not.
much
no.
we
That's a
know.
whole season. We'll just do a whole season on
Yeah.
that place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was really unique that I loved about it, all the vegetables they served
Mhm.
were all Japanese vegetables.
Mhm.
So they created a farm and brought all the ingredients over to make sure that they kept it, to its core.
Yeah.
And that's why it was like, this is probably the closest I've ever been to having like Japanese food.
Mhm.
And just
Yeah.
and it felt like it. You could feel it. It was just like, this is real.
Yeah.
This is dope. This is good.
Like in terms of the process, the ingredients, the
Yeah.
entire thing, like
Yeah, everything.
from start to finish or whatever.
And you get the thing that was also amazing about it was using Kyle as this like great example of it. He came to the table and told the story behind the dishes
Yeah.
and how they actually came to light in Japan. Like one of the just briefly, one of the salmon cores,
Mhm.
or it was a salmon. It was one of the bites. The most amazing flavor. I can't even.
Yeah.
I'm not even doing it justice right now.
Yeah.
But
It's
the process,
unspeakable.
right? The process was done by an indigenous village
Okay.
that was high up in the mountains, and because of the cool air that came through, they were able to, like, in a way, correct me if I'm wrong here, Kevin, freeze dry. They were using the tunnels to preserve the fish, and it gave it this like mouth. It melted. It was amazing.
I mean, Bryan, your descriptions are so incredibly spot on. I would just kind of just fortify this by saying that, Chef Kyle did say that the salmon in this, I believe this might have been in the Hokkaido region, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
What they did is the salmon is so incredibly abundant, and what they did is, after flaying the salmon, they actually wove it into like a piece of like wood or so it actually just had something to kind of like hang on to, almost as a scaffold. And throughout the colder winter months, they were able to put the salmon basically against the elements, and the cold wind of Hokkaido kept brushing up against the salmon. In a nutshell, the cold wind almost cooked the salmon. And so what Bryan and I had was a distillation of that idea or that theory. And one of the things that I said to Bryan as Chef Kyle explained this dish to us was, I bet that nobody else in America understands this technique.
Facts.
Yeah, 100%.
I was there like, I don't understand.
100%.
And for us, for Bryan and I, in order to be able to taste this technique, which is so incredibly far from anything that I think either one of us has studied, was so mind-blowing, is that how many times, Bryan, have you and I cooked salmon? Or even just cooked fish in general, like lots of different ways, right? But for you and I to find something that was incredibly new and unique, that wasn't influenced by Europe, and I want to make sure that sentence gets underscored right then and there, it's so incredibly important, because the texture of the fish, it tasted as if it had been sous vide, and I couldn't decipher if it was actually cooked or not.
Yeah.
Just how amazing it just disintegrated on our palates. And the only tragic thing about it is that we had one singular bite of it.
Exactly.
That is the biggest tragedy of all of that.
Man.
It hurts.
Yeah.
That is actually really interesting that you say that, because we were talking earlier about, I had mentioned to Bryan that I listened to Stephen Satterfield on David Chang's podcast recently.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great episode. And the funny thing, he started talking about how, a lot of the way people learn how to produce Michelin quality food here is using French techniques. So you're making French food in America and getting popularized or getting, recognized for doing that. And to do something completely different here in America, like Japanese food or whatever, and be recognized at the Michelin level, it seems like it would be very rare to find a restaurant that's doing Michelin quality food that's not influenced heavily by French techniques or French cuisine.
Well, you know what, Vince? I think that there's a larger shift within the last, 15, 20 years in terms of looking towards Asia as being on equal par with a lot of the great, gastronomic temples of Europe and most specifically France. Like when we talk about food at a very quote unquote high level, what we're really talking about is French food. Like we have to be very, very sort of precise in the locality of that. When we talk about Michelin, number one, Michelin makes tires. That is their main objective.
Yeah.
Okay? Like that's how they are staying in business. If people don't buy Michelin tires, the Michelin guide does not mean a blank thing. Okay.
Yeah.
But like I said, you're seeing a lot more distillations of and larger interpretations of quote unquote Michelin level food in Asia. Like I think Kyoto per capita has the most Michelin stars of any place on the planet.
Right.
Now, obviously, there's a lot of secretiveness in terms of how do people get those. And once again, I think that we can save that for another day in terms of just talking all about the intricacies of Michelin as it relates to food. I know Bryan and I are going to have a forthcoming conversation about how does Michelin intersect with the barbecue scene as well, which is the topic that I have strong feelings about. That I know that Bryan has strong feelings about it as well. But Bryan, could you do me a favor? Could you reintroduce your question one more time? Because I want to make sure that I answer it. Because I think it's a very, very good question.
We're getting close. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're.
Well, I was just saying, basically, when we're talking about, and this kind of segues to the next topic, but why are places unable to do this? Why are they failing? Why are they're falling short of taking the food's authenticity and replicating it? And maybe it is the ingredients. I don't know. Maybe they're not finding ingredients. Maybe it's the training. Maybe it's the lack of research. And then maybe it's the lack of soul. So.
I think that in the scope of how you're framing this question, Bryan, I think there's a lot of things. I think sometimes there is this need or tendency to show off to other people how global I am by adding this one ingredient that you probably don't know about. And I think a lot of times, when you have that, and this goes back to the second point that you made in terms of the lack of soul in food, you see a lot of times with people just adding things just for the sake of adding them, but without understanding them and their usage at a much more refined level. And I think, when we saw a very large influx of Asian fusion towards the latter part of the 90s, I think that we saw a lot of missteps in terms of this gross caricature of Asia, in terms of just, I'm going to take one ingredient and put it into my repertoire of French/American food and call it something brand new. Okay? I can't tell you how many times I've seen wasabi mashed potatoes. And that as really doesn't do anything for me as a fighter.
Right.
Because it's flat out a waste of really good wasabi. And also, not everybody has access to really good wasabi. Wasabi does not show up in a tube. So it's not supposed to come out reminiscent of toothpaste, right?
Yes.
It is a tuber. It is a root that needs to be freshly ground over preferably a shark skin, just to once again have that actual bite that goes along with your predominantly sushi, obviously, okay? Like I said, it's about one-upmanship on one end, but I think also going back to something that I had said in our last conversation, for anybody that's simply tracking one conversation to the next, number one, thank you for your continued support and listening. One of the things that I had said last time in terms of leveraging Dave Chang in his conversation with Lola's Eli, he says that he hates, when talk about, authenticity, he hates authenticity when it's about copying, yet he loves authenticity when it's about preservations. Now, when it comes to the chef, in particular, I think chefs have a lot of decisions to make, which is an incredibly understatement, in terms of if you really take, I think your role seriously, you're really concerned about the overall nourishment of somebody. You are controlling somebody's experience. I mean, case in point, with the whole entire pandemic, eating out is a luxury.
Yes.
And
more so now than ever
16, 17 odd months. In the earliest part of the pandemic, it forced people into the kitchen in which they didn't have an opportunity or a choice to go anywhere else. Everything was simply closed. And somebody had said at the earliest parts of the first part of the closure, we're either going to come out of this amazing cooks or raging alcoholics. There's no denying that.
Yeah.
And so now when somebody has the opportunity, now that the world is so much more open, and certainly there's still areas of caution. We're seeing the Delta variant of the COVID kind of spiking, but eating out now isn't necessarily always a given. But now I think it's certainly going to be that of a luxury. So, as a chef, you're controlling somebody's eating, you're controlling somebody's experience. How do you want to do that? Is wasabi mashed potatoes the way to get somebody to, I can't wait to come back and get that again? It might float somebody else's boat. For me, it just, kind of personally didn't. So, there's a lot of ways to kind of really sort of unpack that. But you know what, Bryan, with that quote from Satterfield, one of the things that I was thinking about, because it's such a very deep quote, was this was the first time, I don't know if this was the first time or not, Satterfield was actually on the African continent.
Right.
And I think there's something so incredibly beautiful about the sons and the daughters of the African diaspora getting that opportunity to return home.
Yeah.
I have never been on the African continent, Bryan. I don't think you have been either. But I think that there is a certain feeling of homeliness and comfort when you get to return back to a place and space that looks just like you. And as we, as people of color, are migrating through a very white supremacist society in which almost every single instance in which we get to look at ourselves is a gross caricature of what somebody else thinks of us, to go back to a space of absolute purity is something that is so incredibly important. I think for Satterfield, as I try to look into his ability to kind of take a look at just simply the beauty of the African continent. So when he's riding around in the boats, in that one scene from the very first episode, by the way, we're encroaching on 6:19. So Vince, I don't know if there's something that we have to kind of like think about.
Yeah, maybe we'll give it like 10 minutes and then we'll check that out.
So while Satterfield is on the boats, one of the things that I was immediately thinking about was Venice. How much do we get to see of how beautiful Venice is, but yet this exact same sort of setup set over here, I believe in Benin, does not get a single bit of exposure. Who is the people that are behind the cameras? Now, in this instance, with Satterfield and the whole entire production cast and crew, I had heard once again from that podcast between Satterfield and Chang that a good majority of the cast was actually African American, which is so incredibly important. So when we talk about representation, who gets to make these final decisions? The overall cinematography of the episodes is absolutely
beautiful.
Striking.
Yeah, it was amazing. Yeah, I mean,
it's so amazing. But Bryan, when he talks about I get to come home and I get to bring them home with me, I think one of the things, aside from food that he's talking about, is the spirit of those Africans that simply didn't make the voyage.
Right.
There was a moment too, I think, in the first episode where he was sitting having dinner. I can't remember who it was for. I think it was the artist, the Ramold Hazumi. And they were looking at each other, and he says, this is our home. And he looked at Satterfield and said, this is your home.
Yeah.
And I feel like there was a moment captured there where Satterfield really was just very struck by somebody telling him that, him being on this continent for the first time. And maybe just, I don't really understand what that would feel like, having all these people around you who are just giving you so much love and welcoming you in. And then someone to actually tell you, you can have a home here regardless of who you are, and having that resonate. I mean, just watching it on screen, I was really taken back when I saw that play out.
Right.
Absolutely. And it's such a very, very beautiful sort of exchange that I know that Stephen Satterfield, I think, humbly accepted, but didn't take it lightly, as well, as he also felt home. And just also that moment in which he succumbs to tears is such a beautiful moment of acknowledgement and simple respect for those who had no choice but to lay down their lives for an incredibly messed up, I'm trying to censor myself, institution
for sure.
That was solely bred for the benefit of white America. The transatlantic slave trade in and of itself benefited the creation of American wealth, which we'll ultimately get to when we get to the second episode, when we really sort of talk about rice in that instance. But when Satterfield has really come to tears, I think also it's really powerful to watch Black men cry. Men in general, but I think also just watching Black men cry too.
I'm working on that.
It's not a contest, but I think
the world may be jaded.
And this goes back to another, conversation, like sort of splinters, even talking about Black masculinity too, in terms of there's a certain stereotype, this typecast of what African American men are supposed to be. We don't feel emotion. There's a whole laundry list that we don't have time to unpack, for sure. In this instance too, but just how he was consoled and held by Dr. Jessica B. Harris is something that was just so incredibly beautiful that I'm so glad made the final shot.
Right.